The theory of evolution is a very well supported theory, and so we're going to look at some of the evidence that we have for evolution. The first is fossil evidence. Fossils are the remains and traces of past life. They include trails, footprints, droppings. They found eggshells. They found, of course, bones. That's what we usually think of when we think of fossils. And the fossils record the history of life from the past. They document a succession of life forms from the simple to the more complex. Sometimes the fossil record is complete enough to show the descent from an ancestor, and sometimes it's not. We don't expect to find all the transitional fossils. Transitional fossils are common ancestors for two different groups of organisms. So let's direct ourselves to this diagram over here. This is believed to be an ancestor of whales, and you can see that it had feet with leg bones, and it's got a nostril that's kind of on the end. This is a transitional species. It still has the leg bones and feet bones, but it doesn't appear to be using them at all. They're up inside the body, and the nasal area has moved from the very end to closer into the body. This is a modern whale. Modern whales have hip bones. They no longer have feet like this animal did, but they have the hip bones. They don't use them for anything, but they have them. And their blowhole is moved to the top of the head so that they can breathe. We don't expect to find all the transitional fossils because making a fossil is very happenstance. It has to fall in just the right mud and not be disturbed and so forth. So we do find some. The next part of evidence is bibliographical evidence, and this means life and then geography. And this means this talks about the distribution of species. And it's consistent with the hypothesis that life forms evolved in one locale and then spread to the accessible regions. A different mix of plants and animals would be expected wherever geography separates continents, islands and seas, so forth. So there are no rabbits in South America because rabbits evolved in somewhere else and they had no way to reach South America. So instead, South America has a cavity which occupies the environmental niche that rabbits hold elsewhere. And I think I've got a picture of him. No, I guess I don't. Well, I did. He's gone now. But we can also see the same sort of thing in Tasmanian wolves. They're now extinct, but they're a carnivore, and they resemble an American wolf. So they have the same niche, but they're not related to each other. The Australian wombat is nocturnal and lives in burrows and resembles the woodchuck. But it only lives in Australia. You don't find the wombat anywhere else. And the sugar glider is the same way. It resembles a flying squirrel, but it's not really related to the squirrel. It just evolved in a different area. And that's kind of what this says. Marsupials, animals in which females have external body pouches where their young complete development. This is like a kangaroo pouch. Evolved from egg-laying mammal ancestors. Today, they are endemic to South America and Australia. Okay. We find anatomical evidence. Homologous structures are anatomically similar because they are inherited from a common ancestor. They may or may not be functionally similar. So we have an example of the vertebrate forelimbs. These are homologous structures because they all contain the same sets of organized bones, but they're used in different ways. They've been modified to meet different needs. So in a whale, the finger bones have been extended to this long degree, and the wrist is way up here. With a cat, the finger bones are quite short, and then we've got the same purple and blue bone, but they've been elongated, and we get an elbow. The horse, The finger bones are here, and then we have the same joint as this wrist joint, but it's up here. And then we have the two bones, and then the one, and then this is the human hand. The fingers, the radius, the ulna, and the humerus. But they're the same bones, they've just been modified, sometimes made longer, sometimes made shorter, to fit the needs of the animal. Vestigial structures are fully developed anatomical structures in one group that are reduced or obsolete in similar groups. So most birds have wings. I can't think of any that don't, but they might be one. But not all birds fly. And ostrich and penguin are examples. They don't fly, but they have wings. Other examples would be things like the human appendix, the pelvic bone in a snake. A snake doesn't need a pelvic bone. It doesn't have legs, but it has a pelvic bone. Analogous structures, and it's really easy to confuse these to homologous, but analogs serve the same function, but they're constructed differently, and they don't share a common ancestor. So this would be something like both wings and birds, both bats, insects, and birds have wings, but the wings are made differently. They're not the same. So that is our our anatomical or structural evidence. We can look then at embryological development, and that gives us evidence of a similarly shared biology. All vertebrate embryos have a tail. Even people. This is a human embryo, and it has a tail that eventually goes away. A chicken has a tail that eventually resorbs and becomes very short, and fish and salamanders and tortoises. There is very strong biochemical evidence. All living organisms use the same biochemical molecules. They all use ATP as their energy exchange system. They all use glycolysis, which is a system where you take sugar and you can break it down into ATP and energy, usable energy. We'll talk about that next week. They all use the same DNA code. We all use the same 20 amino acids in our proteins. So we're able to switch the DNA code from bacteria and put it into another organism because the new organism will read it the same way the bacteria did. Okay, so we can also look at DNA-based sequences. If they're very similar, that suggests a recent common descent. If they're different, that suggests a more ancient common descent. So one of the ones that's very common to look at is cytochrome C. This is a cytochrome that's found in all living organisms, from yeast to your grandmother. And you can look at, and it's been very well preserved. It's a very important enzyme, and it doesn't change very much. So the number of amino acid differences compared to human cytochrome C. Well, the difference between a human and a monkey, it looks like it's maybe 1 or 2. The difference between a human and a pig, a little bit more. Distance between a human and a duck, more. Difference between a human and a reptile, which is a turtle, is about 20. The difference between a human and a fish, a little more, and so forth until you get to yeast, which is a single-celled organism, and there are only 50 amino acid changes between us and a yeast in cytochrome C. There's also evidence in developmental biology. There's a Hock gene, which orchestrates the development of body plan in all animals. And so all animals have this Hock gene, common ancestor, but it varies in types and number. So if you're making a snake, you use it's expressed longer to make the long spinal cord for a snake. Okay, so the last thing we want to talk about is some misconceptions, because there are some things that people don't understand about evolution. And the first one is that it's a theory about how life originated, and it's not. It does not talk about or even address how the first cell came to be. It addresses what we talked about, that it's a change in characteristics observed over time. Some people say that there are no transitional fossils, and this is not true. There are not complete sets of transitional fossils. There are what they used to call missing links, fossils that have not been found yet, or perhaps were never made. It's a iffy thing to make a fossil. Evolution proposes that life changes due to random events. This is not true, because we say that what the theory is, there are environmental pressures. Mutations may occur randomly to create the variation, but that variation then is acted on by natural selection, and natural selection is not random. It depends on your environment. Evolution is not observable or testable. It's not science. Well, that's not true, because we can actually see evolution in action. And when we do more on evolution later in the term, we'll see evolution happening in natural populations. And that's it.